We're over halfway through version 3 at this rate, and this version gave us a brand new path which massively impacted both the balancing of the game and also broke sections of the game. There was bugs related to old characters because they clearly did not plan to do Remembrance as a path at the beginning. Otherwise, the functionality of characters like Aventurine would not have been damaged when they added it into the game. And I just thought it'd maybe be a bit meaningful to go through each path, what they're meant to do, how good they currently are based on the meta as it stands, and ways to potentially help them or potentially restrict them in the future when they are no longer the focus of the meta. We know which path I mean in this case, even though it's the one I have the most attachment to the concept of. So we'll start off with Destruction. This path is focused on burst damage. It targets a single enemy and normally damages the adjacent targets to that enemy, so normally it damages 3 enemies. It has good numbers. It is either going to succeed the most in a situation where there are exactly 3 enemies, or where there aren't a ridiculous amount of enemies where you could be completely flooded. This is the middle section for what a DPS was before version 3. Because we had the ones who excelled at a single target, the ones that excelled at AoE, and then we had Destruction in the middle. It was the type of path that I would have recommended a player to get as their first DPS, back when the game started, and through most of the versions. That's changed only because of an issue with another path rather than an issue with Destruction. There is currently one exception to how Destruction normally functions that exists now, which is phainon. Phainon, before transformation, functions like a normal Destruction unit. He has the burst damage. Once he transforms, he is capable of AoE damage, and it scales very highly. That is obviously a positive in him, and it makes him incredibly flexible. The negative to that is you lose all of his party members. He forces them off of the field, which makes him capable of being quite vulnerable because he has limited ways to gain his health back himself, but he also becomes kind of more tanky, so it's normally not a huge issue, depending on the amount of enemies and depending on how quickly you can get him to respond to things or how unlucky you might be. And his team comp, the way that he builds core flames, actively discourages anything but characters that can target him for single buffs. And the best characters for that are harmony units. His optimum comp is to purely use harmony units with him, or specifically Cypher with him, which means no sustain in any form, which means his team can just die. They will not last as long as other team comps if it's a long-going fight, but he will deal a lot more damage than most. He is the weird child of Destruction here, quite literally. Because he's bordering between being a mix of Erudition as well, which kind of makes sense considering lore implications, but damn. Damn, he stands out. This path is seemingly doing pretty good still. I think that Jingliu's changes have actually helped this path a bit, be a bit more flexible. But currently it is not the best meta path in the game for DPS. We know which one it is, so I'm going to be saying this another 2 more times. But it's just a point worth making. I think that phainon being such a new unit is definitely going to make things around the game cater to him, which by default will help Destruction and another path, but it's not going to make him the best choice. Once next version comes around, and the version after that, I think we are going to see Destruction and all other DPS paths potentially get handicapped. Currently it's already kind of happening. But when it comes to end game modes, this path thrives more so in Memory of Chaos and Apocalyptic Shadow. Pure Fiction, it takes very specific circumstances for Destruction and another path to excel beyond others in. It's the balanced one. Its targeting makes it balanced for most game modes and most bosses. It's not the best in every given situation, but it's certainly not the worst. Next is Hunt. Hunt is single target damage. The most recent unit we got for this was Archer, who utilized multiple skill points in order to repeatedly use his skill to then absolutely go crazy towards the enemy and kill them. As long as he had enough skill points to subsidize it. But usually the aim of a Hunt character is single target, all of the damage goes at that one target. And it makes them very good in Apocalyptic Shadow specifically, and they fall off in the other game modes because single target, it is limited on how many targets you can hit. The more add-ons that potentially an enemy has, for example, the Swarm boss, it creates add-ons constantly. Hunt characters are not as good in situations like that as either Destruction or Erudition. And that's its main drawback. There are many examples of these characters being incredibly strong, but it's situation dependent. Do I think it's doing very well in the meta right now? No. Because the current meta focuses on AoE damage typically, and kind of targets a very specific path that is not Hunt. Do I think that this could be resolved in the future? Yes. I think it'd actually be quite simple to do so. You could set a restriction on the sorts of enemies that appear, neutralize the amount of damage that multi-targeting could do. There are definitely ways to help this path. There are also ways to stop it from going out of control, which is why when it's not being catered to, Hunt tends to be the weaker DPS option. I wouldn't recommend a new account to get a Hunt character first. Next is Erudition. Erudition is the AoE targeter, and it's also the one that I mentioned that phainon kind of fits in with, because lore-wise, his position is kind of linked to that path. But the aim of this is you spread the damage across all enemies, so it's the same damage across the board. This is really, really good for pure fiction. Characters that do AoE or do burst excel in pure fiction, but Erudition has always seemingly had it the best. It is currently though being handicapped right now because there's another path that is capable of the things that Erudition is in the idea of AoE damage that is currently the focus, and we'll get to that. Now we'll go for the supports. There are two supportive classes technically, but they function very differently. One focuses on buffing, one focuses on debuffing. So we'll start with Harmony, which is the buff-related one. You either apply buffs to your entire team or individual allies. These buffs can take a massive variety of forms. All you need to know is the aim is to give your team or singular characters a benefit of sorts. This path is incredibly powerful. To me, it is the most important path to get right when it comes to building teams. If you have the correct Harmony units for a team, you are going to excel. It doesn't really get handicapped in the same way as the DPSs, so it's not as much of a concern. There are situations where it's not as good as Nihility, but typically Nihility is not as good as Harmony. Nihility, though, can be built in its own team comp, while there is no case currently of there being a mono Harmony team. It interacts with other paths, and it is better for it. Next is Nihility. This is applying any form of debuff to the enemy, whether it be single target or multi-target. These characters have changed in functionality a little bit back in Penacony, where we got Acheron. She didn't focus on DOT, which is the main mechanic that Nihility had been leaning towards up until that point. Silverwolf was an exception, but we didn't see a repeat of anything like Silverwolf's gear after that point. It seemed to flop. and resort back to DOT. Acheron was an example of a character who focused on any debuff of the enemy and scaled her damage accordingly. She is the main example of a Nihility DPS. There are others, Kafka was one, and people have hope for the upcoming character Hysolins. But we do not know about Hysolins yet. We'll see when that special program happens. I'm hoping it will benefit Nihility. And now we're in this awkward position where Kafka is now actually a DOT support, and the better units in Nihility aren't even focused on DOT. It's characters like Silverwolf since her upgrade, Jiaoche, Cypher, just characters who aren't actually focusing on DOT at all, and instead by debuffing enemies in a way where they take more damage from your allies, which makes them almost pseudo-harmony, but they're definitely not. I think that Nihility-based comps need a significant upgrade. I think that Hysolins gives a bit of hope for that, but does she guarantee that the problem's going to go away? I don't think so. I don't know if one character is really enough. And I also don't think that it's going to affect... It might affect how the endgame modes are based in the future for one version only. But after that, it's more likely that we're going to start getting units of another path. And that means that Nihility will fall to the wayside potentially again. Which is kind of a shame. When Nihility comps were a thing, they could kind of work in any of the game modes, but they were never the best at them. Unless they were heavily catered towards. I'll discuss Abundance first, because I think that what I'm going to say about Abundance is heavily going to impact what is said about Preservation. There are two actually dedicated sustaining paths, and then there's, of course, another path that's capable of doing it when, you know, it's not specifically what it is. So, Abundance is the first one, which focuses on healing. So this is any form of HP regeneration, whether it be gradual, whether it be on the moment you use the skill or ult. Any fall into this. Abundance is the best sustain currently in the game, with some exceptions, because there is another path that can beat it for very specific comps, and with a very specific unit as well. I would say that Abundance has always been the better of the options, because there's another path that is dedicated towards sustain that cannot get your health back. It is focused on another more generic mechanic, and bosses cater more towards HP regeneration at present than the functionality of the other path. A good example of this is Aquila. Aquila made Abundance quite strong. Not the strongest, but quite strong. It is either the best or second best, depending on situation, sustain option. And then you have really customized versions of sustain supports that are capable of borderline harmony buffing in some ways. For example, we have Huohuo, who can give energy by using her ult. Not much, but still giving energy, which is something previously only Tingyun could do, who is a harmony unit. We have this lean-in from Abundance characters to now be able to do things that harmony characters can do, just in a weaker form. Which is a way that they've kind of scaled and made them more marketable, by making it so these buffs make them the optimum options for very specific team comps. You will always need some kind of sustain. If you were to get one though, I'd probably recommend either Abundance or one later on that is going to also have some problematic connotations, because I don't think after version 3 it will scale very well. The next one is Preservation, which focuses on providing a shield or way to restrict the damage that your allies take for a certain amount. This is the worst sustain path currently. There is currently only one good sustain, which is Aventurine. And in current meta, he's not the best option, especially not if Aquila turns up. He is not able to handle it, no preservation unit is, and not even most of the abundance units can. It is very specific characters that Aquila was made to force people to use. And I think that, in a way, it's kind of tragic, because I think that there is more... I think that there should be a balance between how good the sustains are. I feel like currently we have had abundance catered to so much where it's made preservation redundant. There's nowhere near as many preservation units. They offer far less of them and far less opportunities for them to shine. And I hope that this is something they will fix in the future. Just at present, preservation's not in the best spot. It is the worst under AoE pressure. Under single target, though, it might actually be perceivably the best. And I think that's something they could maybe focus on in the future to improve its odds. If we have a single target enemy unable to deal damage to your team at all because it just breaks through the shield and doesn't actually hit the HP of your characters, you have an undying team. Meanwhile, a single target enemy, in a case where its multipliers are increased enough, abundance then has to potentially fight with the idea of, can it get back as much HP as is taken off of your enemies with no reduction on the damage output towards your characters. It has some countermeasures already in place within the path, in the idea of, hey, we'll leave a field up that gradually heals you. Hi, Locha. But it's not... I don't know if it's enough, and that's my only worry. Now, finally, we're going to talk about the Jack of all trades and the Master of... Well, it's meant to be the Master of none, but it's definitely not turned out that way. Remembrance is the most recent path they added to the game. It broke the functionality of certain characters when it was implemented. It is currently the best path in the game. Why? Because all the content is currently catering towards it. Which is why, in a way, Erudition had an influx of capability. Because Remembrance was getting buffed to push it to sell. And because there was AoE targeting within Remembrance, they let AoE as a whole thrive until maybe there's some sort of way for them to restrict that, which I can totally see them trying to implement to force people to pull on Remembrance. But we'll see. At present, we're currently looking at a meta that focuses on either more than 4 party members or less than 4. And there is only one character that can reduce the count of your party members, which is phainon. I imagine they'll implement this more times in the future. And any Remembrance character increases the count beyond 4. Because the purpose of this specific path is summons. What the summons do is not limited. There are summons for currently destruction and erudition in a way. There is currently a summoning character who does harmony, essentially, and there is currently a summoning character that does abundance. Most of the types of characters, so most of the roles of the paths, so DPS, sustain, and support, have been filled by Remembrance. You can make, potentially in the future, and I'm expecting them to do this, with potentially March or Cyrene, a mono Remembrance team, and it work perfectly fine because you have all of the roles filled out. Your characters won't die because Hyacinth exists. Your characters can get buffed because the Trailblazer exists. And your characters will deal big numbers because Castoris and Aglaya are capable of numbers. It's kind of a mess because ultimately, should one path be able to do it all? I find it funny if it was better balanced. But currently, because they're catering towards Remembrance, it's not well balanced at all. the ones who are benefiting the most from all of version 3 have been Remembrance. Not having a Remembrance unit actively screwed me for ages because the content's catering that way. And I didn't build Erudition on my account, so I couldn't subsidize it without getting a Remembrance character. So I got Castoris for that reason, as well as decently liking her. It's problematic currently because it makes it so Nova paths are really thriving as much as them, but I think it is easy to handicap once we move out of version 3 and into version 4. I believe that you can easily handicap this by putting a restriction on having more than 4 party members. I think that Mihoyo would have to restrict it so any team that has more or less than 4 units in it, or summons or anything, any entity that is on the field gradually gets more and more debuffed. Because it would mean that even in the case where you want to use the Remembrance character more than one of the other characters on your team comp and decide to remove one of them, so you have a 3-party team, so when they use the summon, it turns into 4, you are still losing a lot of damage before that happens. That's the best way I can think of to actually nerf this mechanic when they no longer need it to be a priority. I don't think a single path should have this much dominance over everything, because Remembrance is optimum in all of the endgame modes, because it's capable of all the roles. Even if the DPSs didn't match up to what was required for those game modes, its supportive capabilities are crazy. This has become a jack of all trades and a master of all trades, when it really should have been more balanced to be a jack of all trades but maybe master of none, or limited to a specific role that the summons could have. I think that after version 3 we will see significantly less Remembrance units, and I think that the best case they might thrive in is in mono Remembrance teams or as odd members of specific teams when they're not getting debuffed. I don't think we are going to see them get as many new units as any other path, because I think the other paths are easier to balance. I think at present we are at a flux moment where we're just going to keep seeing Remembrance get buffed. We have yet to see a boss that specifically caters towards Remembrance. I could see them doing that for the finale of version 3. I think that seeing a boss that specifically benefits you based on having more than 4 party members is the best way that they could make Remembrance focus towards in the end of Amphorius, which obviously Amphorius' world does focus on the idea of Remembrance a lot, so it makes sense for them to do that. But do I think they should? I think it depends on how much they'd implement it into the endgame modes, because that boss would hurt for balance once version 3 is over and once version 4 happens. And the inclusion of Remembrance brings something up that I think actually matters. It has made it possible that new paths could be added into the game. While I think it's cool from a lore perspective, I am very concerned about how they go about it, since they already broke the functionality of characters by implementing Remembrance that they needed to fix. Remembrance has not been the most balanced on release, which makes me worry about any other new paths they implement and how balanced they will be. And I'm also curious about functionality because, for example, with sustains, I find it very hard to imagine a new way that they could do sustains. Because what other ways there to positively benefit, to keep your team alive that isn't healing or shielding? Can you think of any? I don't think that you can expand too much more on the sustains. I think there might be other ways to implement supports or implement maybe DPS beyond targeting, but I think that they have a good range already. So I worry about them adding too many things that could just muddy up the balance of how the paths functionally work. I also feel like Remembrance because of how it's kind of associated to certain characters already. I know that characters don't have to be a specific path in gameplay to reflect them in lore, but Black Swan, her entity that appears in her ult, imagine that as a summon. Remembrance Path would have probably done a lot of good for that character. Her kit could have worked almost exactly the same, but had been probably better because of the summoned entity. It also kind of brings up the possibility of a Remembrance character that leans on Nihility, which, yeah, fair, that's something that they could end up doing in the future. It's just a nice little thought exercise, though, to do this, because as things currently stand, the best DPS paths to go for are easily Remembrance and Erudition. Erudition is falling off, though, and I think it's not going to get any better before it gets worse. I think that there's a very real chance that by the end of version 3.7, which is when the story of Amphorius ends, Erudition just won't be a good option anymore, or it'll be a lot weaker than Remembrance to the point where you may as well bite the bullet and pull on a Remembrance character. I think that we have a pendulum effect with the meta of this game, and what it focuses on is based on what the version is prioritizing and what the individual patch prioritizes. And that's the bit that matters. Currently, Remembrance is where it's at. I don't think it always will be, though. And I think eventually we will see a day where Remembrance can be heavily handicapped in certain game modes where people won't have to worry about, oh, I have to get a Remembrance character, I'm never going to be able to do content in the endgame modes. I just have concerns about the implementation of if they do future paths, and I hope that once version 4 comes around, they do start restricting Remembrance, and this is coming from someone who actively wants to build a mono Remembrance comp eventually, and hopes that either Cyrene or March are main DPS material and I can have the other one on their team as the support. I am actively waiting for them, I've been saving them for ages. I still stand by the idea that Remembrance, once version 3 ends, needs to be less powerful. It doesn't need nerfing in numbers when it comes to characters' actual kits, but when it comes to endgame mode, they need to start putting some restrictions that apply only to it in certain ones. Because you cannot have one path dominate this hard. And I think that because of the way that MiHoYo makes money off of this game, they logically will. I think that they will have ways to make it so individual paths will be able to be the spotlight when they want them to be. And I hope that they get implemented, or at least are already considering this now rather than later. Because Remembrance, as much as we didn't see it for a while, they had probably been developing it for a while, it was not created back when the game was first conceptualized. Other characters' kits kind of prove when Remembrance came into existence. It had to be after Aventurine, because otherwise there would have been ways within his kit to bypass the issues that ended up existing for him as a result of Remembrance being added. And that's the only worry I kind of have. They've clearly decided since releasing the game they want to expand on these paths and make them, at least one of the ones that wasn't playable before is now playable. They heavily changed details around that path, because originally, within Simulated Universe, Remembrance buffs were dedicated towards ice damage. That has changed massively in Divergent Universe. The buffs are specifically towards increasing damage, their specific characters, they are more generic than before. And are kind of good for most most team comps that go through Divergent Universe, I'll be honest. There are some cases where Remembrance buffs, individual ones, are so good to get in a run. But it shows kind of where Hoyo is looking and what they're thinking about. And I wonder if eventually we see other paths that exist within Simulated or Divergent Universe getting tweaked around a bit. And if they do, that will make me think, okay, they might be making that path playable. And they might be synergizing its boons inside a divergent universe to work with the path they are creating for it, the way that that path is meant to function. And that's something I think everyone needs to keep track of, because that means we have quite a few potential paths that could end up playable that currently are not, that have been mentioned within the story. We have the Trailblaze itself. We have elation, veracity, beauty, permanence, propagation, enigmata, equilibrium, finality, and order. There are 4 to 6 different paths that either have missing aeons or dead aeons, presumably. There is beauty, whose aeon is believed to be dead. There is permanence, whose aeon is missing, but I'd like to see this playable because of its connection to Dan Hung eventually, even though I don't think they will. There is propagation, whose aeon is sealed in amber. There is order, who was absorbed into the harmony. And there is the Trailblaze. Akivili is presumably dead, but all of these paths, despite the conditions of their aeons, are still followed by people. We literally play as the Astral Express, who follows the path of the Trailblaze. So, all the paths listed have the potential to become playable in the future. Which ones do I think would make the most sense, though? I would say any of the ones that link to the Lord Ravagers. The paths covered by the Lord Ravagers are as follows: preservation, elation, harmony, erudition, veracity and permanence, hunt, and nihility. So, I could see the next playable path being either elation, veracity, or permanence. Out of those paths, I think the easiest one might actually be elation, because I kind of could see it being a buff or debuff related path. Veracity I could see as a debuff path as well, to be fair. Permanence, though, I think that it being a sustain is only fitting, and I think the best way they could maybe implement it is when a character dies, they come back with a certain amount of health. You can basically revive a character so many times, like after so many turns, it has charges maybe associated with it. That's the only other way, outside of HP recovery and shielding, that I could imagine a sustained character existing and actually working. They already implemented that idea into Castoris as a passive for the entire team. Implement it into an actual path. Anyway, hopefully you guys had fun with this. It's just a food for thought video. I'm interested in what they do with the gameplay of this, into the gameplay of the paths. I like the lore implications more of paths than I do their gameplay, but as someone who studied computer science and cares about computing, I like code. I like code quite a bit, actually. This is like a neat little food for thought exercise for me, because it lets me think about a game I enjoy in a way that's more tied to programming and also more tied to user experience and how it personally can be made in a way that suits what the game's story is trying to tell. It kind of expands on all of that. Let me know if you guys have any paths that you'd specifically be interested in seeing. Enigmata to me would probably be the most weird one, because considering the way that Remembrance works, imagine doing the opposite, where summoning using the effect of an Enigmata character removes a party member from the team, and how bizarre that would be. Or removes an enemy, actually. That would maybe be even better. Like a temporary disappearance effect. I think that would be a neat way to integrate things. I think it'd be very funny as well. Especially if, depending on the enemy, it just instantly removes them for good. Like, when you can't remove the bosses, there are some enemies you cannot target, but in, like, mass multi-target situations, you can just be like, poof, you're gone. Or if you vanish specific characters on your team, it applies a buff across the entire team. So it's kind of like a version of the way the new planar ornament set works that focuses on remembrance of what phainon does, without actually being on a bit of kit and instead being in a path. It'd be very weird. Removing characters increases certain stats based on, you know, what that individual new character does based on this. Very weird idea, but it'd be funny to see it integrated. So let me know potentially your own ideas on what certain paths could do and why. Let me know what paths you're aiming towards and what characters you're anticipating, because for me, I just want to see March and Cyrene now. I want both of them. I think that March's 5-star variant is gonna come sooner rather than later. She's either going to be in 3.6 or 3.7, because those are the remaining story versions we have left to potentially get Amphoris characters for, and it makes sense if it was one of those. Dan Hung has the possibility of a new character. Permanence isn't playable, so I don't know what he's going to be doing. Cyrene, she'll probably be Remembrance if she's playable, and I want to see it. Like, for me, currently, Remembrance is my favourite lore-wise path. I love it. But for individual functionality, I actually have characters I prefer rather than the paths themselves. Like, personal bias towards Acheron and phainon. Phainon that I can't build his optimum comp because, of course, upcoming potentially are 2 characters I actively want, so I can't risk getting his team sorted out yet, because I won't have enough pulls for the 2 characters potentially upcoming that I do really want on my account. This game is a balancing act, and I don't have the money to just throw at this game casually. I wish I did, but I don't. It be what it be. But yeah, no. Let me know what you guys are aiming for, what you're hoping for when it comes to meta in the future, because I think right now, hoping for Remembrance to get hit a bit hard is not going to happen until after version 3 is over. We can hope that in the future, when it comes to new paths, they'll balance them better. I think that they might end up needing potentially another game mode in the future based on the amount of party members in a team. I think that could be funny. Because there's no harm in adding more endgame modes. Like, Simulated Universe and Divergent Universe to me don't really count, because they don't rely on your stats as they currently exist. You can buff any character into becoming a monster theoretically in either of those game modes and going crazy. Which is why I've never understood people doing gameplay showcases within those game modes, because it's not a reflection of what the character's meant to be able to normally do. Hopefully you guys had fun with this though, and you take care of yourselves. Bye guys.